Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Environment Secretary George Eustice has told the BBC that the government will look at any recommendations to change the rules around lobbying. Inquiries have begun into David Cameron's contact with ministers on behalf of the collapsed financial firm Greensill Capital. It comes as a senior Conservative MP warns Boris Johnson he'll lose support among former Labour voters unless the lobbying row is resolved. Here's our political correspondent Jonathan Blake.
Letting light into parts of political life that often stay in the shadows. Former Prime Minister David Cameron's lobbying of ministers on behalf of a finance company has led to wider questions about links between government and business and possible conflicts of interest. One cabinet minister who used to work for Mr Cameron defended his actions and those of ministers today, but hinted a government review could bring change.
Once it's concluded, and once all those parliamentary committees that are now looking at this have concluded, I'm sure some of them will make policy recommendations, and of course the government will look at that. I'm not saying that things couldn't be tweaked or improved, but I am saying that it was changed about 10 years ago, and that fundamentally here that the question should be really less about who spoke to who. The question is much more, how did ministers act after those conversations?
Conservatives are worried some of this may be starting to stick and could spell trouble for Boris Johnson with voters if he doesn't do something soon.
Boris defeated what he he described as an out-of-touch elite in the 2016 referendum and won a general election victory. He is seen as different from his predecessors and has won a lot of support as a consequence. He will lose that support unless he acts decisively now.
Labour's Rachel Reeves faced questions about why her party's former Welsh First Minister took a job against independent advice. But there's no let-up in the political attacks.
What we've seen this week is that Tory sleaze is back and that it's bigger than ever. And we need real change to restore trust in our democracy and in the very essence of public service, which matters to so many of us and matters to people in our country.
There are now multiple investigations underway into the rules around contact between politicians in power and those who seek to influence them, including the government's own review. So it's possible, indeed likely, that more details will emerge and be used by some to argue that there are just too many grey areas. What's less clear is whether any of this will lead to lasting change in the way Westminster works. How to regulate access to politicians and ensure they're not unduly influenced are not easy questions to answer. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
The Environment Secretary has defended what he says are the robust systems already in place around lobbying. George Eustice said some tweaks may be needed, but existing rules are already pretty good. Well, his comments come after it emerged that David Cameron approached serving ministers and civil servants by text and email on behalf of the finance firm Greensill Capital. Our political correspondent Carl Dinnan has more.
You might think the boundary between what ministers do in office and any business they do afterwards should be clear. But David Cameron's work for Greensill Capital has shown otherwise. Today, Mr Cameron's former press officer, now the Environment Secretary, offered a partial defence of what his old boss had done.
Does that pass the smell test? Does that look good?
There are rules in place that David Cameron himself put in place, which is that ministers on leaving office shouldn't take such roles for a period of 2 years. I mean, he did leave office 5 years ago, so on the face of it, he hasn't done anything wrong, but he concedes himself that, you know, perhaps he should have written through formal channels just because of the perception.
But more of Mr Cameron's lobbying has emerged. The Sunday Times publishing an email from him to a senior NHS official, Matthew Gould. He requests data for a payment service Greensill was offering the NHS, on this occasion without charge. He signs off, finally and importantly, once this is all over, it would be great to see you again. Maybe for lunch. Let's stay in touch.
Does that really make any difference if an ex-Prime Minister is emailing to offer a free service to the NHS?
What we've seen this week is that Tory sleaze is back and it's bigger than ever. And David Cameron, at the height of the pandemic, was acting not in the national interest, but in his own private interest, looking to secure tens of millions of pounds through a series of share options. And he was exploiting every contact he had.
Senior Tories are concerned about the impact on their support in places like Leigh in Greater Manchester, won from Labour in 2019.
It bothers me that there's this kind of fluid situation between politics and consultants where they can then lobby very easily and go outside of the usual channels.
Well, it's taking advantage of your position, really, isn't it?
If you are not in power, you should not abuse the power using, your contacts to, gain something.
Many people might not be that aware of David Cameron's work around the world for Lex Greensill, but that could change, as both men may well end up giving evidence to Parliament. Carl Dinnan, ITV News.
Now, here at home, former Prime Minister David Cameron's lobbying for a finance firm has been defended by a government minister and described as acceptable. Environment Secretary George Eustice says that existing rules for lobbyists are quite robust, but that tweaks may be possible. This comes as further details have emerged of David Cameron's efforts on behalf of Greensill. Kamian Zeram has this report.
Politics, power and big business. How the elite do their deals, calling on friends in high places to try and get their way, and the rules which are supposed to keep things fair and clean.
Lex Greenhill, where are you? Give us a wave.
The collapse of Lex Greensill's financial technology company has exposed awkward links between the former Prime Minister David Cameron's business interests and the current Conservative government. It's embroiled Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, Matthew Gould, who worked in the Cabinet Office under Cameron on cybersecurity and now runs the NHS digital arm, and Bill Crothers, who back in 2015 started working for Greensill when he was still the government's chief commercial officer. Cameron and Greensill on a business trip to Saudi Arabia last year. Cameron's accused of pushing his lobbying to the limit for the benefit of Greensill, the company in which he held millions of pounds of share options. The government, though, is playing the whole affair down.
David Cameron contacted the Chancellor, asked him to look at a case for a company that he was working for. The Chancellor did that, but came back with the answer being no. No, there's nothing they could do for them. No, they wouldn't do anything to help. And the business then went bust. So fundamentally, if you look at this, the reality is that nobody gave any special favours to David Cameron or indeed to Lex Greensill.
But there are now 8 separate investigations into lobbying, which senior Tories warn could erode recent gains in so-called red wall areas Labour call sleaze.
Conservative former ministers and prime ministers were using their position and their contact lists to exploit the system and to get special deals for them and the companies that they work for. And that's why we must toughen up these rules to ensure that nothing like this can ever happen again.
Look past the people, and the lobbying system itself, agree many, doesn't pass the smell test and needs reform.
I think what we're looking for is, if we're going to restore public confidence, we need a system which is much more clearly at really genuine arm's length from government, maybe reporting directly to Parliament rather than to the Prime Minister. Because at the moment, it looks too much as though it's too easy to duck some of these issues.
Public confidence in politics and the political elite needs little to be knocked. The judgment and conduct of the former Prime Minister, no less, is unlikely to be helping much.